Pine nuts are the edible seeds of pines. About 20 species of pine produce seeds large enough to be worth harvesting. In other pines the seeds are also edible, but are too small to be of notable value as a human food. Species and geographic spread. In Asia 2 species are widely harvested: Korean pine in Northeast Asia, and Chilgoza pine in the western Himalaya. 4 other species, Siberian pine, Siberian dwarf pine, Chinese white pine and lacebark pine, are also used to a lesser extent. Afghanistan is an important source of pine nuts. Pine nuts produced in Europe mostly come from the stone pine, which has been cultivated for its nuts for over 5,000 years, and harvested from wild trees for far longer. The Swiss pine is also used to a very small extent. In North America, the main species are 3 of the pinyon pines: Colorado pinyon, single-leaf pinyon, and Mexican pinyon. The other 8 pinyon species are used to a small extent as a gray pine, coulter pine, Torrey pine, sugar pine, and Parry pinyon. Pinyon is spelled as pinon in Spanish. In the United States, pine nuts are mainly harvested by Native Americans, particularly the Uto Aztecan, Shoshone, Paiute Navajo, and Hopi, and Washoe tribes. Certain treaties negotiated by tribes and laws in Nevada guarantee Native Americans' right to harvest pine nuts. The Pinus monophylla seeds, commonly known as the Nevada soft-shell pine nut, are harvested by commercial harvesters in Nevada, and sold throughout the western U.S. Species list for those seeking to grow edible landscapes. These are the more commonly used species: Old World Pinus pinea, Italian stone pine Pinus cembra, Swiss pine Pinus scoransis, Korean pine Pinus gerardiana, Chilgoza pine, Pinus siberica, Siberian pine Pinus pumila, Siberian dwarf pine Pinus almondi, Chinese white pine Pinus bungiana, lacebark pine, New World Pinus sembroides, Mexican pinyon Pinus arizobensis, Arizaba pinyon Pinus Johans pinyon Pinus culminicola, Potosi pinyon, Pinus remota, Texas pinyon, a paper shell pinyon Pinus edulis, two-needle pinyon, a Colorado pinyon Pinus monophylla, single-leaf pinyon, Pinus quadrifolia, Parry pinyon. Pollination and seed development. The pine nut species will take a time that depends on the exact species to complete its maturity. To reach full maturity, the environmental conditions must be favorable for the tree and its cone. For some American species, development begins in early spring with pollination. A tiny cone, about the size of a small marble, will form from mid-spring to the end of summer. The premature cone will then become and remain dormant until the following spring. The cone will then commence growth until it reaches maturity near the end of summer. The mature pinon pine cone is ready to harvest 10 days before the green cone begins to open. A cone is harvested by placing it in a burlap bag and exposing it to a heat source such as the sun to begin the drying process. It takes about 20 days until the cone fully opens. Once it is fully open and dry, the seed can be easily extracted in various ways. The most common and practical extraction method used is the repeated striking of the burlap bag containing the cone against a rough surface to cause the cone to shatter, leaving just the job of separating by hand the seed from the residue within the bag. Another option for harvesting is to wait until the cone opens on the tree and harvest the cone from the pinon pine, followed by the extracting process mentioned above. Fallen seed can also be gathered beneath the trees. Ecology and status. In the United States, millions of hectares of productive pinyon pine woods have been destroyed due to conversion of lands, and in China, destructive harvesting techniques and the removal of trees for timber have led to losses in production capacity. Elevation and pine cone production. The elevation of the pinyon pine is an important determinant of the quantity of pine cone production, and therefore will largely determine the amount of pine nuts the tree will yield. American pinyon pine cone production is most commonly found at an elevation between 6,000 feet and 8,500 feet, and ideally at 7,000 feet. This is due to higher temperatures at elevations lower than 6,000 feet during the spring, which dry up humidity and moisture content that provide for the tree throughout the spring and summer, causing little nourishment for pine cone maturity. Although there are several other environmental factors that determine the conditions of the ecosystem, without sufficient water the trees tend to abort cones. High humidity encourages cone development. There are certain topographical areas found in lower elevations, such as shaded canyons, where the humidity remains constant throughout the spring and summer, allowing pine cones to fully mature and produce seed. At elevations above 8,500 feet, the temperature substantially drops, drastically affecting the state of the dormant cone. During the winter, frequent dramatic changes in temperature, along with drying, gusty winds, make the cones susceptible to freeze-drying that damages them permanently. In this case, growth is stunted and the seeds wither away. Physical characteristics. Pine nuts contain 10 to 34% protein depending on the species, with stone pine having the highest content. They are also a source of dietary fiber. When first extracted from the pine cone, they are covered with a hard shell, thin in some species, thick in others. The nutrition is stored in the embryo in the center. Although a nut in the culinary sense, in the botanical sense pine nuts are seeds. Being a gymnosperm, they lack a carpel outside. The shell must be removed before the pine nut can be eaten. Unshelled pine nuts have a long shelf life if kept dry and refrigerated to 2 degrees Celsius. Shelled nuts deteriorate rapidly, becoming rancid within a few weeks or even days in warm, humid conditions. Pine nuts are commercially available in shelled form, but due to poor storage, can have poor flavor and may be already rancid at the time of purchase. Consequently, pine nuts are often frozen to preserve the flavor. European pine nuts may be distinguished from Asian ones by the greater length in comparison to girth. Asian pine nuts are stubbier, shaped somewhat like long kernels of corn. The American pecan nuts are known for the large size and ease of shelling. In the United States, P. edulis, the hard shell of New Mexico and Colorado, became a sought-after species due to the trading post system, and the Navajo people who used the nuts as a means of commerce. The Italian pine nut was brought to the United States by immigrants, and became a favored treat along the East Coast in the early 1930s, when bumper crops of American pine nuts were readily available at low prices. Culinary uses. Pine nuts have been eaten in Europe and Asia since the Paleolithic period. They are frequently added to meat, fish, salads and vegetable dishes, or baked into bread. In Italian they are called pignoli and are an essential component of Italian pesto sauce. The upsurge in the popularity of this sauce since the 1990s has increased the visibility of the nut in America, primarily on the West Coast. Torta della nonna is quite a generic Italian dish name that, while in most families just indicates an old family recipe for any kind of cake, very often is used for a tart or a pie filled with custard, topped with pine nuts and optionally dusted with icing sugar. Pignoli cookies, an Italian-American specialty confection, are made of almond flour formed into a dough similar to that of a macaroon and then topped with pine nuts. In Catalonia, a sweet is made of small marzipan balls covered with pine nuts, painted with egg and lightly cooked, and those are called panoles. Pine nuts are also featured in the salad landes of southwestern France. The Nevada, or Great Basin, pine nut has a sweet fruity flavor and is promoted for its large size, sweet flavor, and ease of peeling. Pine nuts are also widely used in Middle Eastern cuisine, reflected in a diverse range of dishes such as kibbeh, sambusak, desserts such as baklava, and many others. Throughout Europe and Middle East, the pine nuts used are traditionally from Pinus pinea. They are easily distinguished from the Asian pine nuts by the more slender shape and more homogeneous flesh. Due to the lower price, Asian pine nuts are also often used, especially in cheaper preparations. Pine nuts contain thiamine and protein. Pine nut coffee, known as Pinon, is a specialty found in the southwest United States, especially in New Mexico, and is typically a dark roast coffee having a deep, nutty flavor. Roasted and lightly salted pine nuts can often be found sold on the side of the road in cities across New Mexico to be used for this purpose, as well as a snack. Taste disturbances. Pine nuts can cause taste disturbances, lasting from a few days to a few weeks after consumption. A bitter, metallic, unpleasant taste is reported. There are no known lasting effects, with the FDA reporting that there are no apparent adverse clinical side effects. Quote, "This phenomenon was first described in a scientific paper in 2001. Publications have made reference to this phenomenon as pine nut syndrome, or as pine mouth. The Nestlé Research Center has hypothesized that nuts from Pinus almondii, which occurs mostly in China, are the cause of the problem. The nuts of this species are smaller, duller, and more rounded than typical pine nuts." A 2011 study found results consistent with this hypothesis, and also suggested that chemicals used in the shelling process might be responsible. Metallic taste disturbance, known as metallogeusia, is typically reported 1 to 3 days after ingestion, being worse on day 2 and typically lasting up to 2 weeks. Cases are self-limited and resolve without treatment. Moller has postulated a hypothesis to explain both the delayed onset of and the long-lasting nature of the metallic bitter taste sensation, involving a well-known physiological process known as enterohepatic recirculation, which Moller describes as a remove, recycle, repeat digestive process where toxins could potentially circulate through the digestive tract multiple times. Nutritional information. 100 grams of dried pine nuts contains calories 673, carbohydrates 13.08 grams, fats 68.37 grams, fibers 3.7 grams, protein 13.69 grams, cholesterol 0 milligrams. Pine nut oil. Pine nuts can be pressed to extract pine nut oil, which is valued for its mild, nutty flavor. One study indicates that Korean pine nut oil may suppress appetite. Other uses. Pine nuts have long been a dietary staple in some Native American tribes. Today, though some tribes still use pine nuts in traditional cooking, others use the hard outer shell of the pine nut as a bead for decorative purposes in traditional regalia and jewelry. In the Great Basin area of the U.S., collecting pine nuts is a protected right through state law and treaty. In the Northern California regions, pine nuts are collected from the gray pine tribes. Burn designs into the hard shell, reflecting the same design they use in baskets, however oftentimes they are left in blank, or burned to blacken. These are more often used in women's regalia and jewelry.